The entire Russian civilian airline industry has been grounded by pro-Ukrainian hackers. Just how did Ukraine get into and ground Russia's aircraft? Plus, we're going to talk about President Trump shortening his deadline for Putin to get his act together. And drone technology. Is it spreading across the globe? Are we seeing Ukraine-style drones on the other side of the world? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay. Aeroflot, this is Russia's national airline, has had hundreds or dozens of flights grounded following a hack. And what this is focused entirely on flights to and from Moscow. Now, the Russia's carrier said that this was just a failure of the airline's information systems and service disruptions are possible. But a pro-Ukrainian hacker group says, no, this was actually us. We got into their IT infrastructure and that actually a Belarusian opposition hacktivist group enabled them to get inside the network. But what I think the group claims it's taken out up to 7,000 physical and virtual servers and gained access to 20 terabytes of data. Now, this would be bad for a bunch of reasons. One, because you could literally reconstruct the flights and movements of key Russian personnel and oligarchs, as well as military and civilian members. But I think what this really is about sending a message to the Russian public to say, listen, this war that your government is perpetrating, it's not without consequence, right? We know that Vladimir Putin has worked tirelessly to insulate the Russian population from the war, right? That's why he hasn't implemented a draft or a broad mobilization. He's relied on volunteers from the Russian periphery, right? Far away from rich urban centers, focusing on recruiting ethnic minorities, extremely poor Russians, people with no political or social capital within Russia. They've also, of course, tried to sort of segment off the defense industry and focus entirely on preventing it from really bleeding into the civilian industry. But that's starting to fail. It's starting to stagger because what we're seeing is that the Russian civilian industry is also increasingly going simply bankrupt. Inflation remains very high in Russia, and troublingly, the jobs that should accompany it simply aren't happening. And every time you have an attack like this, it deals economic damage, certainly to Russia. Again, these flights represent key parts of the Russian economy, but also, more importantly, it is this message to the Russian public that says, not only are you unable to afford food, not only is there an undeniable number of casualties, not only has Russia failed to achieve its goals, which were transparently nonsensical to begin with, but that you yourselves are facing consequences. Your individual lives are going to be disrupted because you've engaged in this preposterous military expeditionism. And now things aren't going to get better for Russia, that's for sure, because it seems like President Trump is at least increasing his ability to talk a big game. But before we talk about that, I wanted to mention, guys, you know that on this channel, right, I make a lot of controversial takes, and it does not always endear me to advertisers and sponsors. That's why me and the team depend on you guys to keep us in the business. But don't worry, we reward you guys. That's for members over on combatvetnews.com. This is my version of Patreon. It works just like Patreon, but every single dollar supports me and the team. There's no cut being taken by YouTube or by Patreon or by other hosting services. And twice a week, every Tuesday and Thursday, we get uncensored combat footage, including stuff sent to me from units on the front lines, and we do a deep dive breakdown of the status of the tactical nitty-gritty of combat. So if you want to support the channel and get access to that, plus get access to the Q&A, you want to become a member, the link is in the description. Okay, so what I also wanted to talk about is, of course, Trump tightening back. Now, I made fun of Trump yesterday because, well, frankly, his 50-day window was not moving. And now, of course, maybe somebody from the administration is listening to my channel because suddenly his deadline is now 10 to 12 days, which, again, is fascinating because, art of the deal, the time warp. I think he's right. I think his assessment is correct. Though I am someone who believes that the U.S. is at its strongest at negotiating when it's highly credible. And this whole you have 50 days to do a deal. Well, you have 10 days to do a deal. Well, remember, this is the third 2-week iteration that Trump has imposed on Vladimir Putin. So it's really tough to take this sort of stuff seriously. But Trump continues. He says, I'm going to make a new deadline 10 or 12 days from today. There is not a reason for waiting. Now, this would put it on remember, the initial 50-day ceasefire window was July 14th. The original, but this is Trump is basically saying it's obvious Putin has zero interest. And, Ukraine sent a high-level delegation to their peace talks. Russia, of course, sent their own delegation, and the peace talks lasted less than an hour. They agreed to prisoner exchanges, something that's gone on for at least 2 years. But Vladimir Putin has continued his policy of launching just a massive wave of strikes across the country. And I think this is the takeaway here, is that you can see that the Russian, Trump is, again, coming to the conclusion that the rest of the world was concluded for a long time, which is Vladimir Putin just lies. He just says a bunch of stuff that's not true. The West continually believes that discussions, talks carry weight, but Vladimir Putin is an FSB agent. He's a KGB trained agent. Okay. He understands how to do deception. So what you have to do is view what he says, even to you, as a public performance, as a theater for an audience of one. And you have to look at his actions. And Trump concludes the same things we've all concluded, that for a man who says he's interested in pursuing peace, he targets civilian sites, he takes a bunch of antagonistic actions. Again, if you were looking to de-escalate the situation and you were Russia, because remember, Russia is the bigger country. They are currently generally on the offensive, right? Ukraine launching only extremely localized, limited counterattacks. Vladimir Putin could simply stop attacks unilaterally. He could unilaterally engage in any number of peace processes. And Ukraine has said repeatedly they're interested. They say, listen, we'll do a 72-hour, we'll do a longer sustained ceasefire. Again, Russia has sort of jokingly said, oh, well, we can do a 72 or 48-hour ceasefire. But Ukraine has said, listen, you don't get to call timeout whenever you want, okay? That benefits Russia primarily as the person taking the most attrition in this war. So the fact that Trump is out here saying these things, of course, Trump said, right, he would... speaking alongside Prime Minister Keir Starmer, Trump said he thought he had a deal with Putin to end the war multiple times, only they never materialized as Moscow continued to launch attacks on Ukraine. And what really sort of annoys me about this is that, again, Trump realizes he's been played, that Vladimir Putin, they have great discussions, and then Putin goes out and starts launching rockets into Kiev and kills a lot of people in a nursing home with bodies all over the streets, which is funny because, nothing is more classic a boomer than being like, yeah, he hit that kid's school or he hit a hospital. But none of those things bother the boomers. But when you hit a nursing home, they are like, what? You targeted America's seniors or Ukraine's senior citizens? You monster, you criminal. Like, okay, that's some boomer shit right there. Again, is Trump going to actually roll out consequences? It's tough to say. I think the biggest selling point, the biggest reason to believe him credibly is that Trump has shown he's credibly willing to be tough on China, or at least take actions vis-a-vis China. And the fact that he's realizing that Beijing is become more overt and explicit in their support for Russia. In fact, economically, China is the ally that has been backing Russia. And the thing that's sort of needs to be implied here is that Trump's plan to introduce secondary sanctions to anyone that buys Russian oil, that's code for China. China is the secondary buyer of Russian oil, or China is the buyer of Russian oil. And so what he's talking about is instituting a massive tariffs on China. That's what this would entail. This is troubling because, again, you may know that Trump just said he had to deal with China. This is the second time he's announced that he totally 100% for realsies this time has to deal with China. And he's literally out here in the press saying, actually, guys, we're going to walk this one back. It's one of the reasons why the market simply doesn't react to this sort of thing, because his words do not matter at all. And I think, I think the level of naivete of the administration remains just unbelievably frustrating to me. And it is very hard to decide what Trump wants to do, right? And secondary sanctions are fine. The Russian, public, but the Russian public has shown a willingness to tolerate things like casualties that a fully democratic country would simply be unwilling to do, right? Because Russia maintains tight grip on the media, it's harder for this data, right? Information about the scope and scale of casualties. It's hard for that to get sort of out, so to speak. And so I think that secondary sanctions are just not going to be sufficient. Also, China and Russia have had a lot of time to build up their relationships. And I think the fear is that China may not actually want to get hit with these tariffs, or that Trump himself may not be willing to roll out the scale of these sanctions. And I'm using sanction and tariff interchangeably because they are interchangeable concepts. The fact is that you call it a tariff simply when it's your friends and it's economic in nature, and you call it a sanction when it's political in nature or in cause, but they functionally are the exact same thing. Now, what I wanted to talk about is another interesting story, and this has to do with Thailand, Cambodia. Now, Thailand and Cambodia, you guys might be aware, are actually stuck in a border clash right now, and this is a little bit of political theater by both governments who, for various reasons, need to prove to their publics that they are like hardcore people who aren't going to like lose territory. They're both pretty like neurotic about their countries losing territory. Historically, it's happened quite a bit. And particularly given that this territory includes some like ruins of what each of them view as sort of like an important part of their country's heritage, this has kind of become a big showdown. But what I think is more interesting is that the Thai Royal Army has released combat footage showing its domestically built armed drones dropping mortars directly onto Cambodian military positions and weapons depots. And this is really interesting because, well, the Thai Royal Army has clearly been taking notes, and the fact that even Thailand, which is increasingly like a middle-income country, it's got a much more robust military than Cambodia. But they still have sat there and said, listen, we think these drones are so cheap and effective that they are going to be worth it. And it seems to be true, right? You can fly a drone for 15, 20 kilometers and drop a mortar with precision. And you get instant feedback on how that mortar strike behaved. In contrast to an actual mortar, you've got to get within 10 kilometers of the position. You won't actually get to know how your mortar hit unless you have another person even further forward. And so the fact that they are saying, listen, we want to scale these things out, shows that, again, this is not... Sometimes technologies in battlefields, they're one-off. They're tricks that are unique to the battlefield specifically. And I'm one of those people that thought, I don't know if quadcopter drones are going to have the same kind of effect in a dense jungle environment, right? Because we see with FPV drones, they rely on kind of a very low angle of attack. Well, if you're talking about the dense Thai jungles, the dense jungles of the Thailand border, you see these trees, there's no chance of quadcopters getting through there. But as we've seen with these bomber drones, they are proving that they are actually highly effective in this role. And just the precision and the cheapness is very, very. I think it's game changing for the Thais, particularly given that the alternatives are things like fixed wing aircraft. But look again, if you're fighting in the jungles of Thailand, you're a long way from an airstrip and the ability to get sort of an eye in the sky and a weapon in the sky. Wherever you are, as long as there is literally a few feet of tree clearing, you can launch that drone. This is part of the appeal. And the fact that we're seeing them be combat effective in multiple different types of theaters is a sign, I think, again, that the U.S. military needs to be on board with this. They need to scale up this technology. It needs to be in the hands of the force today because it is an unusual situation. Usually, the U.S. military invests tremendously in technology. They look 10 years down the line. They say, let's build the future today. Let's start building the future. And they make their best guess. The nerds at the Pentagon say, what do we think the future of war is going to look like? What could it be? And they make their guess and they say, well, what tool would let us win this war of the future? And they say, so the call they made was saying, listen, we need to have a stealth fighter that can kind of do it all, Swiss Army knife, that can do reconnaissance, deep strike, electronic warfare. That's why they invest in the F-35. Very expensive, highly capable. But the issue is that while they're sort of correct, right? The F-35 reportedly just cut through Iranian air defenses like butter. The issue is that they also are saying, listen, there was a little sub-branch of warfare, particularly in small unit combat, that we never expected. And that is the use of individual quadcopter armed drones, FPV drones, strike drones of various sorts. And the fact that the U.S. military missed this entirely and continues to miss it, right? They do the same thing they always do, which is stand up a bunch of Pentagon offices with no authority, no legal right to, and no ability to scale things out to the force. And they just kind of, like make a bunch of PowerPoints. There's no number of PowerPoints that will equal an actual combat drone dropping weapons onto targets. And I think the fact it should trouble you that the time military today is able to drop more effective drone munitions, right, on that tactical level than the U.S. military is disturbing and troubling. And the fact is that when we look at we looked at the video a couple days ago of the U.S. Army bragging that they had found a way to drop a grenade off of a commercial quadcopter drone. So, and again, let that sink in, that the U.S. military was bragging. Have you ever seen a drone drop a grenade? Guys, the Thais are dropping mortars with their drones. They're hitting real targets. So we should, again, the feeling you should have is at least for me, is some level of like dread. Because one day, here's the problem, is that the U.S. military won't scale up these drones. They're not going to acquire them at the scale they need to. They're too bound up by red tape. And you have a country like China where ultimately, if Xi Jinping wakes up tomorrow and says, we need to build 1 million drones, they will build 1 million drones because he is a dictator. He can cut through the laws. The laws exist to facilitate his will. The only thing that will stop him is physical logistics, the literal ability of the Chinese to build these drones. But here's the problem. Almost every drone in Ukraine, particularly things like Mavics and Autels, they're built in China. China already has the industrial capability to scale up the drones because they are literally building them. Russia just got busted fielding Chinese-made drones, wholesale drones made from China. And China is just being allowed to do this. So what China is effectively doing is building a modern war industry. And that is pretty disturbing. The fact that the Chinese have, acres and acres of factories that can build drones, that can build modern weapons of war. And the U.S. has almost no ability to do these things. They don't even have the systems. Our troops can't use them. Our troops probably couldn't develop them if they wanted to. It's completely insane and absurd. And unfortunately, the fear is that, like Russia, who went into Ukraine with a highly trained professional army that was considered one of the best in the world, the Ukrainians, over the course of the next 12 months or so, wiped that entire force out. Most stats I've seen were that about 90% of that force that invaded Ukraine in 2022 is KIA or wounded so severely they're not going to return to service. And so the fear is that the current U.S. military, the best U.S. military, is going to have to get ground down into nothing before the U.S. finally realizes it has to invest in these capabilities that China is building out now. And again, if you needed more of a sense of urgency, this stuff in Thailand and Cambodia should do that. Anyway, guys, thank you so much to all our Colonel tier members, folk like Peter Fucci, Dan M, Petchitoro, Henry Russer, I just got called Chris Rossi, L90, Sergey Zinchenko, D Stewart, James Porsche, B Hammerling, all of our Lieutenant tier members. Join me over on Combat Vet News tomorrow for another Uncensored Combat video drop. Link is in the description. See ya. Cheers.